Well, again, good afternoon to everybody. Delight to be with you, even though I'm coming here at a difficult time in our country's life, difficult time in the culture. Just think here in Minneapolis, the summer began with the terrible political assassinations of Speaker Hortman and her husband, and of Representative Hoffman's shooting of him and his wife. And I met both of them last March when I was here with Archbishop Hebda for our visits. Then, of course, the summer ended with something perhaps even more horrific, the shooting of those two kids in Annunciation School, the traumatizing of how many hundreds more. We witnessed just recently the murder, seemingly in cold blood, of that young Ukrainian woman in Charlotte. And then, of course, last week, the murder of Charlie Kirk, which has convulsed the country. A lot of people wondering what's happening to us. I want to focus a bit on Charlie's murder. I knew him a little bit, admired him, and have been watching this convulsion in our country. What's causing it? Well, you say the death of this young man at 31, leaving behind a young wife and kids. Sure, of course. But I'm quite convinced there's more to it than that. I think what it is in his murder, we felt shaking something fundamental in our society. And the giveaway is the fact that he died with a microphone in his hand. What I mean is not a gun in his hand, not a knife in his hand, not a grenade in his hand, but with an instrument of communication in his hand. In witnessing that, whether consciously or not, I think we understand something fundamental is endangered. You know, watch him in action. A lot of people are opining about Charlie Kirk. Watch him, YouTube, there's thousands of videos. He liked to go to campuses, fairly hostile places to people with a conservative mindset. But he'd go there and he would express his point of view, and then he had him a microphone and he'd say, come on up and argue with me. Come up and debate with me. Prove me wrong. And that's exactly what he was doing the day he died. He was speaking with someone more liberally minded, and in the very act of doing that, he was murdered. This unnerves us, and it should unnerve us, because something in our Western civilization is threatened thereby. I think Charlie Kirk was standing in a very venerable tradition. Go all the way back to the man who in some ways is the founder of the Western intellectual tradition, Socrates. Socrates rarely gave lectures or speeches. What he did is he went in the streets and byways of Athens and he encountered mostly young people, and he would ask them questions. Then he would question the answers they gave him. He would probe and he would push and cajole, and he'd ask people to draw out the implications of what they believed. And in this lively back and forth, he felt he was coming closer to the truth. His greatest disciple, Plato, gave us in his famous dialogues just a kind of literary version of these Socratic conversations. Aristotle, Plato's greatest disciple, had a school called peripatetic because people walked around together, conversing, and in the conversation they came closer, they thought, to the truth. Draw a straight line from Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all the way to Oxford and Cambridge, where the principal method of teaching is not the lecture, but the conversation between tutor and pupil. That's the Athens side, if you want. The other great formative influence on our Western culture, the Jerusalem side. We can find much the same thing. If you're in a Jewish context and you're seeking truth, you don't listen to lectures so much, but rather two interlocutors sit apart across from each other with the scripture or the Talmud in between, and they argue and debate and they question, they cajole, they criticize, and they attend to conversations from long ago where people centuries before were doing exactly the same thing. In the lively give and take, they come closer to the truth. My intellectual hero, St. Thomas Aquinas, represents a Christian version of this. Thomas, the greatest of the masters of the medieval university system, rarely lectured. Rather, he engaged in what they called questiones disputate, disputed questions, where a master like Aquinas would propose a topic And then he'd hear objections from the floor. And keep in mind, in the Paris of the 13th century, his interlocutors probably were kids in their teens and 20s. And they'd raise objections, then Thomas would give his answer, then respond to the objections. When we read the texts of Aquinas, they can seem rather dryly scholastic, but we have to see behind them this very lively dialogue discourse. Well, both Athens and Jerusalem contributed, it seems to me, to our founding fathers in the 18th century, who gave us precisely a political ethos based upon lively public exchange, debate, conversation, all predicated upon freedom of speech. It's very deep in the Western consciousness that kind of public discourse is a good thing. And it's an antidote to violence. Something I love that Charlie Kirk used to say. He'd be challenged by a kid who would say, "What are you doing here on campus? Why are you here?" He would say, when people stop talking to each other, bad things happen. When people in a relationship stop talking, divorce happens. When a society stops talking, civil war happens. Quite right, it seems to me. And that stretches right back to Socrates and provides a foundation for our society. Let me take a further step. What are the assumptions behind this conversational model of truth? Two, it seems to me. First of all, a profound respect for the dignity of the individual human being. Look, if I don't have that respect for the dignity of the individual and I want to find consensus in my society, all I got to do is seize power and then imprison, torture, or at the limit, kill my opponents. You think that's a wildly unrealistic scenario? Think again. In my lifetime, certainly in the lifetime of my parents, this was practiced on a massive scale all over the world. When you stop believing in the dignity of the individual, violence takes the place of real conversation. The second great assumption, I think, is some sense of shared context of meaning. What I mean are values, both epistemic and moral, that condition the conversation. If we agree on this fundamental context, then we can have a real argument. I can say, no, you're not honoring it sufficiently, or no, you're not seeing the right implication, or no, you're now in contradiction to it. But if we don't share that common view, it's a bit like kids going to play baseball and each one making up their rules. So when I hit the ball, I can run directly to second base. Well, then baseball ceases to exist, and what ensues is bickering and violence. Respect for the dignity of the individual and a sense of a shared context of meaning. Let me take one more step. Where do those come from? I'm proud, happy to proclaim it in this very beautiful and sacred place. It comes from a belief in God. And take the belief in God away, you will find in very short order those two things evanesce. And when they evanesce, our conversation devolves into violence. Thomas Jefferson knew it, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. We're not equal in any other way, as far as I can tell. We're not equal in beauty or strength or power or virtue, but we are equally created by God, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. By the way, the government doesn't give us our rights. God help us if it does, because if it does, it can take them away. No, our rights come from God. And this is why we think individual human beings are subjects of an infinite dignity, because we believe in God. Also, if there are laws and intelligibilities at the epistemic and moral level, they come from the mind of a lawgiver. This common framework of meaning we recognize as the result of a decision of a Creator God. When we stop believing in God, that shared context of meaning disappears. You know, I've been tracing this for a long time in my evangelical work. The disaffiliation from the churches, especially on the part of young people. When I was a kid back in the 1970s, 97% of Americans identify with a religion. Now, they weren't all saints. I'm one that wasn't a saint. But they identified with a religion. Church going was at a much higher level. Numbers now are as high as 26% of our country has disaffiliated from a religion. Among young people, it's as high as 40 to 50%. Oh, don't worry about it. You know, deep down they all believe the good things and Yeah, if you cut flowers out of the earth and put them in a vase, they'll look okay for a while. But trust me, in fairly short order, they will wilt. If you cut the values that we believe in out of their source in God, maybe for a time they'll exist in the society. But in relatively short order, they will fade away. Can I suggest to everybody, this is the spiritual heart of the problem. When we stop believing in God, when especially young people don't hear anymore the Beatitudes, they don't hear anymore the Ten Commandments, they don't hear anymore Matthew 25, whatsoever you do to the least of my brothers, you do it to me. When they don't hear the parable of the Good Samaritan anymore, something disappears from our national consciousness. The very things that make spirited, creative dialogue possible. Let me make an explicit connection now to law. Go back 33 years. A decision taken by the U.S. Supreme Court in the matter of Casey versus Planned Parenthood. To my mind, maybe with Dred Scott, the worst decision ever made by the U.S. Supreme Court. But let me read to you a bit of the famous adjudication. Our Supreme Court said, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. That's all, huh? At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and the mystery of human life. Now, I'm sure the people that wrote that and formulated that never thought for a second that this would conduce to violence. But I can assure you, as night follows day, it does. Now, why? The condition for the possibility of a real conversation is some shared context of meaning. Something outside of ourselves that we recognize as objectively right and good and beautiful and true. But when I say it belongs to my liberty to define my own universe, and you to define your own universe, and you define your universe, and you define yours, we got nothing in common. We can't really have a public conversation. And what happens, therefore, when we disagree? Violence. The problem we're facing, it's not just a problem of law enforcement, although that's part of it, not just a problem of cultural and all, that's part of it. At bottom, everybody, it's a spiritual problem. It's a spiritual problem. This violence is coming from a loss of faith in God. Cardinal George of Chicago was kind of a mentor to me. He used to say, law indeed has a protective function. So law protects us, protects life, and so on. But law, he said, also properly has a directive function. Because the law teaches us what we ought to desire and what we ought not to desire. Law is meant to direct the will toward the good and away from evil. When law becomes simply a matter of defending individual prerogatives. It's lost its way. Can I suggest to all of you here gathered for this Mass, in this holy place, recovering the moral and high spiritual purpose of the law in helping to reform a society in which something like spirited conversation can take place. Using the law to shore up those now shaking foundations that allow us to engage in the kind of dialogue that Socrates and Thomas Aquinas and Thomas Jefferson and yes, Charlie Kirk wanted us to do. The fact that he died not with a gun in his hand, not a knife in his hand, not a grenade in his hand, not exercising violence, but with a means of communication in his hand. Can we take that as emblematic of the kind of society that we want? And can we see your work in law, as essential to a spiritual revival that we need in our country?
Bishop Barron, what message is Pope Francis sending by canonizing figures like Romero and Paul VI?
Well, keep in mind, whenever a pope, canonizes, he's sending the message about holiness. So to be a saint is to be a person of heroic virtue, and the Church always wants to bring holy people forward. So that's the general sense. I think with these two, though, with Romero, a great martyr, someone who gave his life in service of the poor, is something close to Pope Francis' heart. And then Pope Paul is the great pope in many ways of evangelization. He writes this letter called Evangelii Nunciandi, which is very close to the heart of Pope Francis. And it's about the Church, by its very nature, is missionary. It goes out. So think of Pope Francis as he becomes Pope, says that's the whole purpose of the Church, is to go out from itself, not to turn inward. So I think those two messages, this great reverence for the poor and a Church that goes out from itself, those are things he sees in these two great saints.
Are there any critics or people in the Church opposed to the Pope's decision to canonize Romero in particular?
Oh, probably some who might see him as too associated with, the politics of Central America or with a left-wing, political point of view. And that's been true over the past couple decades. I think the Pope sees him as a pastor. I mean, he was someone who identified with the poor, and he gave his life in service of them, and he spoke out on their behalf. So I don't think he sees it in political terms. He sees it in pastoral terms.
Just making sure. Oh, you don't see my head. Okay.
Nope, no, sir,
Fantastic. Because sometimes I move like that. Okay. Romero's been set up for sainthood for a while, but it's been delayed under previous popes. Why?
Well, people speculate. In the case of John Paul II, was there some concern that there was a hyper association with left-wing politics? I'm not sure if that's really the case. Benedict XVI, of course, who was very close to John Paul II, is the one who really green-lighted the beatification of Romero. So he was not opposed to it by any means. And I think he's just very close to the heart of Pope Francis as a Latin American, and he's had a great devotion to Romero. So that's true of all the popes. They have special affection for this person or that, given their background. So I think that's really why it's happening now.
So why are Romero and Paul, you keep saying John Paul, and Paul VI considered controversial or unexpected choices for canonization?
I'm not sure I would say that Romero is an unexpected choice. He's been talked about for a long time. As I say, maybe some would see him as associated too much with left-wing politics, but I think anyone that studies his life honestly and seriously sees him as a great witness and a great pastor and a martyr. So in my mind, he really should not be a controversial choice. To me, he's a very natural choice. Paul VI, something I find fascinating about him is how he transcends the left-right split. So on the one hand, he's a great advocate for the Church's social teaching. His great letter, Populorum Progressio, is a very, if you want, progressive take on social issues. On the other hand, he writes Humanae Vitae, which is the great statement against contraception, a document which has been extraordinarily prophetic. You read it now, 50 years later, and you say, boy, this thing really saw what was coming. So to my mind, Paul VI transcends the usual splits. Now maybe people on either side of that divide might see him as controversial. I see him as embodying the depth and breadth of the Catholic teaching.
That's great. Pope Francis hailed Paul VI as an outward-looking. Well, what's the significance of this praise when Francis himself faces a position for modernizing the church too much?
Well, it's, again, Evangelii Nunciandi. So the church by its very nature is missionary. That's what Paul VI saw. And by the way, he took the name of St. Paul, who was the first great missionary, the one who brought the message out to the wider world, finally here to Rome, and then through Rome to the rest of the world. And so Paul VI, Montini, saw that as the great mission of the church. A young Jesuit now, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, back in the 60s and 70s, reads that letter. And he said that's the decisive letter that interprets Vatican II. So now he brings it as Pope Francis to the heart of his ministry, the church that goes out. Very often he said when the church turns inward, it's like, oil that goes bad, it goes rancid. That rather the church has to spread its message. So to me that's a very natural connection that he would want to bring that part of Paul VI's teaching forward.
Interesting. On Saturday, Pope Francis defrocked 2 Chilean priests for abuse of minors. And on Sunday, he canonized 2 controversial figures in Catholicism, whether you can say they are controversial or not. What kind of stance and messages do these 2 actions amount to, do you think?
Well, the Chilean thing, I think the Pope is saying very clearly he wants us to be transparent on this sex abuse matter, and he wants accountability to be in place at all levels of the church. These are pretty strong actions he's taking. To defrock bishops, that's a pretty strong statement. And I think he wants to signal clearly to the whole world that A, he's taking it very seriously, and he wants accountability at all levels. So the fact that bishops are being disciplined, that's something I think really new. And many felt that back in 2002 in the United States, when there was a great focus on the misbehavior of priests and disciplining priests, there wasn't a sufficient interest in the misbehavior of bishops and their discipline. I think now the Pope is saying that's what we have to do, and you see it very clearly in that case.
Well, talking about that, do you think that when Pope Francis defrocked the 2 Chilean priests, he was increasing his favor with critics who say he hasn't done enough with the handling of sex abuse?
Well, I think he's signaling clearly that's what he wants to do. Is he responding to the critics? I think he's responding to the need of the moment, that the church has to have accountability at all levels, from top to bottom. And it's a very vivid way of instantiating that idea.
Talking about Romero, the Pope was wearing his blood-stained belt. What message was he trying to send with that?
I found that very powerful. So the Pope at the canonization mass wore the cincture, which is the belt around the alb, and that Romero was wearing when he was shot. The fact that Romero was killed while celebrating mass is for Catholics a very powerful thing, because the mass is the representation of the suffering and death of Jesus. And so the priest is acting in the very person of Christ. And so for a priest to die at the altar that way is extremely powerful, participating in the most vivid way in the martyrdom of Christ. And so the Pope wearing that cincture today with the blood of the martyr on it was extremely powerful. I found it very moving.
That's great.
Good man. All right. Hey everybody, it's Bishop Barron. I'm standing outside of the North American College where I'm staying while I'm in Rome. It's the end of a very long day. It was the first full day of the Synod, so we had about 8 hours of interventions and speeches and all that. And then right afterwards I went over to an event sponsored by the Ethics and Culture Center at Notre Dame. And it was a great event. Young people speaking about their faith, and then I responded to them. John Allen was there, the Catholic journalist. And so it was a good event, but it's just been a super long day. So keep praying for me, and I promise I'll be praying for you. God bless you.